Hey, welcome to Quick Answers with Craig. This is a simple, encouraging way for us to answer the questions that people are asking. When you hear that phrase, quick answers, I don't want you to think, again, too simplistic of answers. These are very complex answers to complex questions. We just do them in bite-sized format. Today's question is a really good question. It's a question that I've been asked many, many times, and I think a very valid question. Here's the question. What should we conclude about the practice of polygamy that's practiced by so many of the Old Testament heroes? Now, if you're not familiar with polygamy, it just means the practice of having many wives. So how would I answer that question? Well, first of all, we got to look at several things with respect to the biblical record. So the Bible records that many great saints of the Old Testament, on many occasions, had more than one wife. In fact, in many occasions, not just more than one, but several hundreds, like David, greatest king to live, or Solomon, hundreds of wives and concubines, which honestly seems to be in flagrant disobedience to God's biblical design for marriage. Polygamy, the practice of many spouses, is in fact a disregard for the original design of marriage that God set forth in creation. I think it's not only clear in the Old Testament record, but also how the New Testament appeals to the Old Testament, saying marriage is to be monogamous, meaning one wife, one husband. That's the way it was intended by God for all generations. So how do we make sense of the polygamy of these Old Testament heroes? Well, if you look carefully at the opening chapters of Genesis, you'll see that after Cain kills Abel, the first murder, Adam and Eve have another son whose name is Seth. When you look at the genealogy of Seth, the two sons of Adam and Eve, right, we see that the descendants of Seth are characterized by godliness and righteousness. In fact, it's out of that line of Seth that Methuselah comes. So I want to read it for you. Verse 25 of Genesis chapter 4, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for God said, He hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, who Cain slew. Now listen to this. And Seth, to him there was also born a son, and he called upon his name Enos, and it was there that men began to call upon the name of the Lord. So from Seth came Methuselah and Noah, as well as Enoch, and Enoch was so close with God, he was directly taken into God's presence. Now, if you look at the line of Cain, as opposed to Seth, it reads like a rogues gallery. I mean, just one rascal after another. One of the chief kind of rascals, whose biographical sketch is included right here in chapter 5, is a man by the name of Lamech. And Lamech is distinguished for two things. One of them is this nasty song that he writes and sings in Genesis, which basically is a celebration of violence, right? But he's also noted for being the first polygamist. Now, the Bible doesn't say he was the first polygamist and this is a bad thing. No, it just mentions he was the first polygamist. He was the first one in human history to have multiple wives, but it does so in the context of describing the most radical expansion of human corruption and fallenness. Meaning the Old Testament is implying that polygamy is in defiance to the law of God. Now, obviously, God didn't call these Old Testament heroes for their polygamy, and He didn't punish them for it. He dealt with it. Ultimately, that extreme fallenness through forbearance, meaning God forbore. He gave a forbearance of that sin, and that forbearance ended ultimately with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and the new covenant. So even though God didn't deal with it, He was not adding or giving His blessing or approval to it throughout the Old Testament. He had forbearance on that sin of polygamy, and ultimately it was dealt with through the death, the burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So this has been Quick Answers with Craig. Again, thank you for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to this channel. You can hit the bell to maintain or be up to date with all the notifications. We'll see you next time.